Good evening, everyone. My name is Savannah Hood. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and thank you, Krista, for sharing your work with us. Krista is an associate professor of photography at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. She also holds a BFA in photography and an MFA in interdisciplinary studies. Her work has been widely and frequently exhibited nationally and internationally in several prestigious venues. To name just a few, she's been exhibited in the Paris Photo, Copenhagen Photography Festival, Denmark, several venues in Lithuania, the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, and the ISE Cultural Foundation in New York. Her pieces are included in several private collections and public institutions, again, across the US and internationally. And again, just to list a few, she's been featured in Los Angeles County Museum of Art, known colloquially as LACMA, and the Cesis Art Museum in Latvia. Here again is just a sampling. Krista has received numerous awards and residencies at the Center of Photographic Art, the Artist Grant, the Baumanis Creative Projects Grant, the Rhonda Wilson Award, the Puffin Foundation Grant, and a Bemis Fellowship. She was an artist in residence several times, including at the Cooper Union in New York, the Vermont Studio Center, in Linwood Park Town Place Residency in Philadelphia, and also Picture Berlin. She's a multidisciplinary artist whose work explores ideas of home, dislocation, and profound impact of architecture and landscape on cultural identity and human psychology. That being said, I'd like to open up my first question for Krista. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how it helps shape the work that you make?
Yeah. I'm going to give people a check a second. Sit down. And then before I answer that question, I just want to thank Savannah for doing this Q&A, all the students who I see, several of you that actually helped put this installation together. So huge thank you for that. And then of course a big thank you to my husband who also helped in this 3-day install of all this work. So thanks for having me here and thanks for helping me make this happen. Sorry, tell me the question again.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your background and how it helped shape your work?
Okay, yes. So I am a daughter of refugees. So both of my parents came to the United States after World War II. They were fleeing Soviet occupation at the time. And they lived in these displaced person camps in Germany before they could come to the United States. And so that history, I've grown up with that history, with the stories of that history, and so that's shaped quite a bit of my work. Actually, it's shaped all the work that you see here is different versions of that history and told in different ways. So yeah, my background is very much a close part of how I produce the work that I make. Yeah.
So the work on display can be grouped into 4 series, listed in order of production from earliest to most recent. They are Displacement, What Remains, and Echoes of Resistance, and Portraits. Would you tell us a little bit about each series and the process used in each one?
Yeah. So I started researching my own family refugee history and displacement history with the series Displacement, which are those 3 pieces on the wall there. So as I mentioned, my parents were fleeing Soviet occupation, so the Russian army came into the Baltic states in 1940. 1941, there was these mass deportations of individuals to Siberia. And essentially those people that were sent there, not many survived. They were in very dire conditions, it was very cold, they had no shelter, so many of them perished. And so many of the people that fled learned that their families were on a list of next to be deported. And so many individuals kind of fled. And the way they learned that they were on this list is in 1941, later in 1941, the German army came in and took over the Baltic states, and then those lists were released actually to the public. And so when the Russian army was coming back into the Baltic states in 1944, as the war was changing, then those families knew that they had little time to kind of stay in their homeland, so they had to escape. So everyone escaped to Germany. Everyone was fleeing to Germany. And then once in Germany, as the war ended and unfolded, then these refugee camps were set up. And they were set up for various nationalities, not just for Baltics, but for, you know, people of Polish descent, people who are Jewish, you know, all different populations. And then they were filtered in through these camps. And the Baltic people throughout Germany had roughly maybe about like 200 camps that were dedicated to Baltic individuals. And those were primarily housed, Germany was divided into different sectors that were run by different countries. So the US had a sector, France had a sector, Russia had a sector, and then the British had a sector. And so those refugee camps were primarily housed in the US, French, and British zones of Germany. So I knew that both my mother's family and my father's family, they ended up in the US sector of Germany, and they ended up in refugee housing there. And so growing up with the stories as a child, I never really understood like what that meant, what it really meant to live in those spaces as a refugee. So I had this urge to kind of find that out. And so I started traveling to Germany to locate those spaces that my family lived. And then it just expanded. It kept expanding. So the Baltic community is tight-knit in the States. And we often, you know, we all kind of know each other. So my very good friend, you know, she said, can you find the camp that my mother was in? And then my husband's family was in a camp. Can you find the family that, you know, that we were housed in? And so it just kind of escalated from there. And so I documented about 50 displaced person camps that were dedicated to Baltic individuals, including the ones that my family was in. And to discover where they were located, now that was a big push. Individuals that were housed in these camps knew the town that they were housed in, but they didn't know like what street or specific location that the camp was located in. So I had to dig through archives, various archives in the US and some in Germany, to be able to just figure out where to find these refugee camps. And as I was digging through those archives, I kept coming across these letters. And they're the letters that the refugees were sending to the US and UK and Canada asking for asylum. They're basically explaining they couldn't go back home because they would be seen as enemies of the state, and they needed to try to find a home elsewhere. And so, through this like process of sort of research and development and like working through my studio, I had been printing the photographs and then learning at that time, I was at a university learning how to use a laser cutter. And I thought, well, could I merge the text from these letters with my images of those refugee camps? And so that's where the laser cutting and burning started happening. So I started literally burning the text from these refugees into the images of the refugee camps. And as much as possible, I tried to partner a letter that like, literally came out of that camp with that image of the camp itself. So that's where the journey kind of began with my family history, and then kind of expanding upon that. So the next half of that, you know, I documented 50 of those camps, and then I started traveling across the U.S. and Canada and finding individuals that lived in those spaces, starting with my parents and those that were close, and then I kept finding more and more individuals. I often get asked, how did I find these individuals? Facebook was huge, so there's like the communities on Facebook, and I would reach out that way. But other ways were, if you know, I came into someone's home, I photographed them, they saw that I was okay, and then they would refer me to another friend of theirs who also had the same history. And so then that also became a referral process of meeting individuals and going to their homes. And so I throughout the U.S. and Canada, I don't know how many states, very many states, but I've done at least 100 portraits of former refugees, Baltic refugees, and so there's about 60 of them in that room there. And it was very important for me because the story is about a loss of a homeland and finding or creating a new one, creating a new home. So it was important for me to actually travel to them and document their new homes that they were able to create. So once that series kind of came to a close, I started thinking about, this is where What Remains comes to play. So I started thinking about the buildings that were left as like remnants of that history, of that Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. Those are buildings that were built during Soviet occupation. They're lasting remembrances of occupation in those countries. Individuals who lived during occupation do not look fondly at those buildings when they look at them. And so I started thinking about, about what was left behind in this history, visibly left behind in that history. So I started photographing those buildings and then pairing them with traditional Baltic folk textile patterns. So during occupation, there was a forced cultural suppression. So keeping kind of that history of folk traditions, which is very much important to the Baltic people, that was seen as an act of resistance, a quiet act of resistance. And so I started thinking about that in tandem with those buildings. So again, using the process of laser cutting, I photographed the buildings, printed them out, and then laser cut those traditional textile patterns into the backgrounds. And those are patterns that are used, you'll see them like in tablecloths, in curtains, you can see them in, in mittens, in embroidery, scarves, things like that in culture. And then I started thinking about, another family story. So there's a legend in my family that is still a mystery to me and that I'm still trying to like piece together. But during Soviet occupation, similar to what you're seeing in Ukraine, there was a resistance force. And they tried to over as much as they could resist Soviet occupation, and they tried to kind of skirmish with the Soviet army while they were there. And that resistance force was called the Partisans, the partisan movement. It's often sometimes coined as the Forest Brothers as well. And they lived in these underground bunkers deep in the woods. And then they would come out and they would, try to skirmish with the Soviet army and try to repel them. And these bunkers were literally deep in the woods and very, very hidden as much as they could. So they were doing this sort of guerrilla warfare at the time. And our family history is that my grandmother's brother, who's here, was part of that movement and essentially perished in that movement. But we don't really know how he perished. So, I've been digging through our family archives. There's some strange correspondence that he wrote to the family while they were, refugees in Germany. I have a very strange Russian POW card of him being captured. But then there's nothing after that. So it's a really big mystery as to like what really happened to him. So I'm still researching that. But that's what got me started in the Echoes of Resistance pieces, which are the color pieces that you're seeing here. So I traveled to Lithuania during winter, like in January, colder than this. And then hiked through the woods to find these bunker locations and photograph them. So I photographed quite a few, and then I started producing the images with an old 19th century process, photographic process, where you can actually produce an image with plant matter. So you can, crush up leaves, crush up petals, crush up flowers, and it can produce an ink. And then through the sun exposure process, you can actually produce an image. And so that's how all of these images are made. They're through natural pigments, and they're through plants that are from that region, plants from that area, from that geographic area. That's a very long answer to your question.
How does the exhibition title encapsulate your project?
Yeah, so a little bit like what I was talking about what remains, like silent witness, like the same thing with the forest too. Like see in that image, there is a marker, but there are a lot of them that don't have, you know, actual crosses or markers for the fallen. But they are all witness to these events, and it is quite silent in these days as to, you know, people who know what happened there and who know the history. Kind of that history is revealed, that it is sort of like a silent marker to that history.
Can you discuss the importance of seeing the buildings and archival documents in person? I guess what I'm asking is, what role does investigation play for you?
Yeah. So research is a huge part of my practice. I wouldn't be able to like photograph these locations or, you know, photograph those people without doing a lot of research. And it's very powerful to be in archives and then all of a sudden like see your family's name on a list, or and kind of see information about your family that you didn't know existed in an archive like that. So plus the archive, I find archives absolutely fascinating. I find it fascinating to kind of leaf through history, read things that maybe weren't necessarily supposed to be made public, but you know was information at the time that kind of reveal more mysteries and kind of interesting facts about the time. So the historical archives are fascinating. There's a Lithuanian archive that's in Chicago. There is a Latvian archive in Stanford University, and then there is an Estonian archive in Minnesota at a university there. And so the Lithuanian one's an interesting one. I spent a lot of time there finding a lot of the letters. And that was a repository that was created by basically creating a general call out to the public, asking individuals who had carried this, like any kind of material, any kind of documentation or anything of their time as refugees, to be sent and housed into this archive. So it's all, you know, individuals kind of donated family photos, donated these documents. And it is an extensive amount of documents. It's kind of amazing how these refugees came to the United States with all these documents with them. And some of them are like very obscure and strange and just interesting to read, like just small little bits of information. So yeah, it's really fascinating to kind of dig through all that.
Do the locations that you visit alter your theme or process? Do you ever have unexpected challenges that come with that?
Yeah. Yes, there's lots of unexpected challenges for sure. When I was traveling and photographing the refugee camps, there were a lot of interesting encounters that happened through that. So some of the camps are today, they could be like businesses, like that house a space that houses for businesses. They could be private residences. Some of them have been turned into private residences. Some have been turned into, like, there's one that's a library, but they have all different kind of functions. And so several times, you know, I would photograph places that were now private residences. And sometimes, you know, people are a little bit, have some questions when you're photographing their private residence, right? So they might come out and they might ask you a question about that. So I had some really interesting conversations with individuals. So several people would come out, well, a couple times people came out, asked me, you know, can I help you? What are you looking for? But every time I mentioned this history, the German population was very generous. They were like, oh, okay, completely understand. Please photograph what you need. Several of them tried to be like very helpful. And they would say, you know, these are not the nice buildings. The nice buildings are downtown, down the street, and that's where you want to be photographing those historical. And I'd have to say, well, I'm not really here as a tourist photographing that, you know, those kind of buildings. This is what I'm doing. And in several cases too, they were able to actually help me find some locations. So I have like a printout of some of the buildings I was looking for, so I could make sure that I was photographing the right spaces. And sometimes if I was looking for something, I'd say, do you know where this building is? And they'd be like, oh yeah, that's around this corner, around there, and then they, tell me where that building was. So yeah, there were some really fun, kind of interesting challenges, with the process.
Well, I think it's hard not to think of your work, and particularly in concepts of home identity, dislocation, and belonging in relation to what's happening in the U.S. today. Have the events impacted you in a way? Have the events impacted the way you think about your subject or process?
Yes. So when the war in Ukraine started, that was a huge pivotal moment for this work. And this work started also gaining more traction at that time because it was literally like a repeat of history almost. So, and I've had some wonderful experiences with Ukrainians where they've come in to share their stories of fleeing a flight and what's happening now, and then also sharing how that relates to this history as well. And during this time as well, not only Baltic refugees were being housed, but also Ukrainian refugees were being housed at this time. So I've had individuals at talks that talk about this history as a Ukrainian in the past, and then also talk about this history now, what's happening now. So that was a really big pivotal moment for me and for this. And I think it's important to understand history. History does repeat. We don't want it to, nor should it, but it is important to understand that we have this history is important to know, and it's important to understand so that it doesn't get repeated, and so that we can prevent this kind of thing from happening. So I find that a really important part of my work, is just sharing that history.
Could you tell us a little bit about your career and how you decided to become an artist? How do you make connections, and how do you find places to exhibit?
Yeah. So I started photographing in high school, but I was a maker since I was a little child. So, before I started photographing, I was like painting or using clay or doing something else since I was a little girl. And then in high school, one of my teachers, I had taken every art class possible, and then they said, well, why don't you take this darkroom photography class? And so I started taking that, and then I was just hooked. I was hooked at just taking photographs and photographing from that point on. So I've been photographing for a long time, and all through the transitions of darkroom to digital and to all of that. And then I think there wasn't any kind of option other than to somehow have art in my life or be an artist. So I don't know if I really had a choice in the matter. I think it just sort of was a necessity. And how to make connections. So connections is really important. It is about building a community, and it's about supporting one another. So I would say, I have friends who have artists, I support them, they come and support me. I think it's really important to build a community where you support each other. And then inevitably from that, like exhibition opportunities grow. For a perfect example is this one. Suzanne Cameron Barron, who asked me to come here. We've been friends for years, and we met in the New York art community as painters. And she's asked me to be in this exhibition. She's part of my network, she's part of my community, so yeah.
There are a lot of young art students in the audience. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, advice for you guys. I think just exactly what I was talking about just now. I think it's very important to build a community. So stay in touch with your friends here that are graduating. You never know where someone's going to go, what job they're going to have, what connection they could make for you. But that is my biggest suggestion, is to stay networked, stay in a community, build your community, and support each other as much as you can. because that grows different kinds of opportunities, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'd like to open questions up to the audience now.
Yes. Right in the back.
I was most struck by the pattern on these buildings, so a few questions. What were you hoping to achieve visually by superimposing the pattern on the buildings? And those patterns seem very regular. There seems to be more irregularity here. Is that intentional? And lastly, how did you achieve that regularity and that randomness?
Yeah. Okay, that's a lot of questions. So that is, it's text actually. And usually a person can probably like make out the first line. I started that series where I entirely cut the text out of the whole image. So I have a few pieces where the image is completely cut with text. And then I started moving to this where it, like as you said, it looks like there's a randomness, there's parts of the images that are disintegrating and parts that are revealing. And that very much has to do with the idea of the history being revealed or disappearing as these generations fade away that remember the story. And so the randomness, yes, that is a very difficult part of that process. And also sort of an acceptance of how the machinery works, how the laser works. So I learned in producing those that there's like an odd algorithm on how the laser moves through the paper to burn it, to cut it. And I decided to embrace that and kind of enhance that as in that process. So I make pretty complicated files that embrace the randomness of the laser, so that they feel more erratic and more not completely uniform. But that's in learning how to accept the machinery and kind of help it do what I want it to do. Yeah. So that was in making that I learned how to do that. And then for this, same kind of process. I make a file, but the file's quite intense. But in this case, the laser cuts it in its entirety. And in that case, I'm actually stopping the laser at points, stopping and starting the laser at points for it to do that. And in this, it cuts and burns the entire image. So that's why that one feels way more uniform. Did you have a third question? Or is that everything?
Pretty much everything.
Okay. Oh, wait, and then I think you had a question.
Yes,
Yeah.
so you had mentioned how you were using the natural pigments of
Yes.
the geography in that area.
Yeah.
Was that, a way, an innate way of experimenting with your medium, or did it take a little while for you to get comfortable with, printing pieces that way?
Yeah, it took a while. I took a class, actually, to kind of get more in depth on that process. And then I started producing the work. And there's a lot of trial and error, because there's a lot of, you can get some really beautiful plant pigments, but they won't necessarily give you a good image. So there's a lot of like trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing and that, yeah. Yeah, I can go to you first. And, yeah, no, I'm right behind you, and then you, and then you.
For the pieces that you use the laser for, I was wondering how you managed to mount them, how you mounted them onto the frame, because
Yeah.
it looks like they're either attached to the glass or like maybe raised from the frame in a certain way where I can't really see what's raising this.
Yeah, so all those pieces, they float in the frames, and that was important to me too, because of the way that the images are cut, the shadow kind of creates another interplay in those, like it creates another subject. And so, yeah, there's some like magic going on in the framing there. There are two pieces of plexi, and there's like some support that hold it in place, and that's how it's kind of done. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I'm mainly wondering about the big piece behind you.
Yes.
Since nobody has really talked about it,
Yeah.
was the thought process for this one different than the rest of your pieces in the gallery?
Yeah, so this is an old family photograph. Actually, it's the only family photograph that we have of my grandmother's brother, so my great uncle. And because he's like so much of a mystery, and this is like passed down tale, I wanted to kind of blur out his face and blur out his defining features, because there's so much of a question about him, and there's so much that I don't know and so much that I want to learn. So this is how he kind of feels like to me, because I really am still trying to piece all the information together about him.
What, speaking still with
Yes.
this one in the back,
Yeah.
are the triangles connected to it at all surrounding it? Because I don't think you touched on that.
Yay, thank you for asking that. Yes, so the triangles are actually, they're taken from an overhead map of one of the locations of where I photographed the bunkers. So they're like little trees. So like this is an overhead like map of where the location of one of those bunkers is. Yes, yes.
Also for all the photos of the trees here, what paper did you use? Because it looks handmade.
Yeah. It is sort of handmade. It is a yeah, and I guess I should talk about that too. So it's called anthotype, is the 19th century process. They're called anthotypes. And they're produced with plant pigment, but they are not light fast. So that basically means that like if you show them in light, they will fade over time and they will disappear. So to be able to show them in a space like this and for them to kind of stay open in an area in light for some time, I had to like reproduce them. And so these are reproductions digitally, and they're produced on like a very nice deckled edge Panamule paper, photographic paper. Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Do you take,
Swing over here.
do you take
Yes.
other influence from artists within other mediums, whether it be, music, sculpting, painting?
I do. I really, yeah. There are several. Yes, there are painters, sculptors, definitely different mediums for sure. I like making work that's physical. So even though this is photographic, I like that it has like a sculptural, physical feel. So then I gravitate towards other individuals that work that way. There's a photographer I really like, Lisa Wilson. She makes photographic sculptures. So that's where I kind of get some influences from. Yeah.
Did you design the patterns on like the traditional patterns yourself, or did you get them from like reference material?
Reference material. Yeah, so they're taken from reference material and then kind of multiplied. You probably wouldn't see them like so dense like that, but they are taken from reference material and then multiplied, yeah.
And there's this change in atmosphere for me when I walk into this front room, then into this back room, and with the bright lights and the way photographs are, with it's very vibrant. Would you say that was an intentional part on your end, and why?
Yeah. So I wanted this room, with the bunker and kind of the low lights to feel, and it's got like if you listen, you'll see like birds chirping. So I wanted it to kind of have a little reminiscent of you like being in the woods, feeling like in the woods. The bunker itself if you're very quiet, you'll hear like whispering in the bunker. There's sound in there and there's whispering. I wanted it to have a very tranquil kind of feel to this space, and that's very different. I think of those portraits really as like a celebration of resilience. So I process them differently like that, and with a lot more color, a lot more vibrancy.
There are many ways that you can display photographs. What made you choose to make it so that they have the adhesive on the wall? Because with that and putting them on foam or other mediums to display them, I'm just wondering what made you choose. like wallpaper?
Yeah. I like the effect that it has when it's very, very large scale, almost to the same scale as your body, so it almost feels like you can like walk into those woods or walk into a space. And I wanted this room to feel very much like an installation and not just like a group of photographs on the wall. So I wanted it to feel more encompassing. So that's why I decided to do really large scale prints and prints that kind of adhere directly to the wall.
I kind of wanted to step back into that room
Yeah.
and ask you about, all the interviewing and the connections you made. Like, how did that impact you and the people you interviewed? Like, and kind of going along with like the feeling of vibrance in that room, of celebrating resilience. But I'm sure there's a range of emotions that you and others experienced. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about that.
What a great question. So in that room, you have audio as well, and the audio is taken from interviews. So I'd come to the individual's house, take their portrait, and then record their story of flight and migration. And yes, there were lots of emotions going on through a lot of those interviews. And there were lots of tragedies that were shared and moments where, we have individuals who are crying and individuals who are very, very extremely upset, and then kind of sharing that pain and space with them. I'm getting a little emotional thinking about it. So it was really like an honor to really, really be present in those stories. Just give me a minute. And I wanted those portraits to really celebrate what they've been able to accomplish, and what they've been able to remake for themselves, a whole new life here. And so it was really important for me to show that in the stories that you see in there, in the individual things that are in those portraits. And as you walk through the room, or as you walk through that room and look at those spaces, you're always gonna see hints that go back to the homeland. So you're always gonna see, you might see some of those textile patterns in those pictures on pillows. You're gonna see, photographs. There's always something that connects them back to their past and their history. But yeah, it is a very emotional journey, kind of sharing trauma together, and then rebuilding yourself in that trauma. But thanks for asking that question. Yeah.
So you focused in those photographs on, I guess, your parents' generation, correct?
Yes.
So I was just curious to know whether you also had an opportunity or were interested in talking to your generation, and if so, what you maybe discovered about that generation's relationship to the events of their parents that lived through.
Yeah, so in gaining access to some of these individuals, there would be, the first access point might be a daughter or son in my age bracket, and then we would, first talk about that. And I think, like I said, the community is very tight knit, so we've always kind of discussed that shared history that we've had, and I think that's what made a lot of individuals very open to letting us into their homes, knowing that we were part of that generational trauma and that generational history. I haven't really thought about, photographing my generation, but, generational trauma does exist. I mean, we do carry these memories even though we haven't lived, necessarily through them. And I do think about that a lot in the work that I'm making, whether this is like a cathartic thing for me to kind of produce this work and like kind of releasing something of that generational history. Yeah, it's an interesting question to ask. Yeah.
Krista,
Yeah.
earlier you talked about when you were in school, I took this course, I did painting, I did this, and then finally I found photography. So I think all the art students go through the same thing, they learn all of these techniques, but then there's a transition where all of a sudden it's put to the service of an idea. In this case, about this exhibition that we have here. So can you think of the moment when, as an artist, all of those techniques that you learned, all of a sudden you had the idea where, oh, now I know what they're for. I can put all this talent into this idea.
Wow, Mary, that's a big question. Gosh, can I remember the moment?
Or even this show.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely talk about everything that I've learned, kind of continuing to build upon that, right? I don't think I'm finished learning, really. And I don't think I'm finished learning technically either. I mean, a lot of these things that I'm doing, I'm just trying. I'm trying to figure out how to use a laser with a photograph, you know. I'm taking a class to know how to do prints with plant material. But all of that, like, curiosity was what I learned in school. So all of that was from accepting failure, I guess. Accepting, like, trying something and failing at it, and trying something again and failing at it. And then figuring out what's going to work. So when I start working on a series, I don't always know what the end outcome is going to look like. I'll take the photographs. Like, I took the photographs of those refugee camps and I sat with them for a while, and I thought, you know, it was very weighty history. I thought, like, what am I gonna do with these things? Like, what can I do that's going to honor that history? And then just, you know, by happenstance, because I was learning how to use a laser, and I had this text, I thought, well, like, can I combine text and image together in an interesting way? And it took me a long time to figure out how to do that. But a lot of that is just, you know, accepting, kind of trying something, thinking about it, and then failing at it, and then trying it again, and then finally figuring out how to do it. Yeah, I guess that idea of always being curious, always pushing yourself in the studio, always trying something new, not stopping, right? That's important. I have a lot of friends who have stopped making. It's important, like, you have to be resilient enough to just keep making, whether it's gonna work or not. And it might feel like nothing's working, but eventually it will. Eventually it'll work, and you'll figure it out. But you have to have that, like, stamina to keep going. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, you talked about your family, right? So I see it the way you spoke about it. All of a sudden there was a convergence.
Yeah.
There's this art, and then there's this history, and all of a sudden it converges.
Yeah, there was very much like a lens. Yes, there's very much a lens at some point where I started thinking about, in that way, yeah, if I started thinking about, like, what is my unique story that I can tell, right? Like, what is something that I know that is really authentic to me that I can put out into the world and tell? And then that's where that kind of came through, yeah. First I'm gonna go here.
Yeah, I have a question about the buildings.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in what you said about how you went to these homes and the people would come out. And I'm curious to first of all, were they fully aware of the history of the building that they were living in, and what was their experience in finding out what had actually happened there? And then I'm curious about, because they're sort of like portraits and you have them sort of, you know, very ominous, and I'm wondering how you felt about them being either repurposed and forgotten from what they originally were, and what your feelings of the buildings in particular are.
Yeah, so all of these buildings that were built during occupation, except for maybe the one that's right behind, except for the one that's right behind you, they are all currently being used as apartment complexes. So that's structures that were built during Soviet occupation to house people, and they continue to house people. So I didn't have those interactions that I was talking about there, 'cause these are in the Baltic countries. Like, that one's in Estonia, that one's in Latvia. The one behind you is in Estonia. That is also in Estonia, that one. So, and like I said, they're remnants of this like oppressive history. And it'll be interesting actually talking to individuals about the buildings while I was there. You know, the individuals that lived through occupation absolutely abhorred those buildings. You know, we want them torn down. They're unhappy with them. But then the younger generation, who hasn't lived through occupation, are kind of fascinated with them. Because they are strange structures. They're strange structures, they're odd, they're built in a weird way. So they're a little bit fascinated with it as an object and aesthetically. So there's like that duality happening.
So if they were to take them down, would you actually find that more of a blight because now it's covering up what had originally happened?
We're kind of stuck with them for various reasons. They're kind of stuck with them because at one point, they were owned by the government, and then they kind of sold them to the individuals that were living in them for like very, not so much money, and so they're kind of like, the people that live there are kind of stuck with those. And so what some of them have done, not the ones that you're seeing here, some of the individuals who live in those spaces, they kind of came together and decided to like rehab the outsides of them. So a lot of them are like rehabbed and painted in color with color, so they actually don't look so bad anymore. Not as sort of depressing as these do. And that's happening more and more, that they kind of, individuals are coming together to kind of rehab the building. So in that way, they're trying to, kind of, I suppose, take ownership or like repossess kind of that history, since they're kind of stuck with them. But yeah, I don't think that there's any danger in the Baltics of ever forgetting that history, ever. There's too much remembrance of that, so I don't think it would ever be lost. Would I be sad if these buildings? I mean, I don't know. They're fascinating to me in a love-hate way as well. I didn't live through the occupation. But it is fascinating to see what is left of history, as a documentarian in that kind of way. So yeah, maybe I'd be a little sad. There's a pretty famous one. There's a U-shaped one in Lithuania, and it was a movie theater. And it's like, it has a weird U-shaped roof like this that kind of goes. And there's a lot of debate about tearing it down or making it like a preserved monument site, because the architecture of it is like so strange and unique, and it was built in a very significant way. And eventually, it's been kept. So it is being preserved. So yeah, I think there's like a dichotomy kind of happening in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at your pictures in the other room here, and one of the things, they almost look like you photographed them while you were sitting, or maybe you took them from waist height, and it almost reminds me of like the old Duoflex camera, which is a 1940s, 50s camera, which is the age these people would have been displaced from, and I wasn't sure if that was intentional or just a coincidence.
Oh, I love that. Maybe I'm just gonna use that. Well, a lot of it, yes, I mean, it was very intentional where I was positioned with the camera, for sure. I thought about that. But a lot of that has to just do with, where they are in space, capturing their whole figure, capturing the room, kind of also not, if you shoot from too far of a height, right, you foreshorten people. So yeah, so it was a little bit about, about making sure these individuals aren't like minimized in their space, but actually, kind of very significantly held in their space. So yes, there's that going on, but I love that. Yeah.
Is there an interview in particular that sticks out to you the most?
Not one in particular. There are a lot of interviews and a lot of stories that stick out to me, and a lot of very terrifying events and things that are hard to carry as an individual. There's a lot of stories that I've heard that are very difficult. I will say that I'm hard at work in putting those photographs and those stories in a book, so that individuals, like, you know, of more vast population will be able to read this history. So I'm hard at work at doing that, so that those stories are shared. Yeah. Yes.
So, can you tell us more about this piece in this center?
Yeah. So this is a representation of one of those Forrest Brothers bunkers. So it would look something like that, and they're usually housed. Sometimes they're housed in like a hillside. There's one that was housed that I went to that's housed in like a riverbank, kind of on the side of the riverbank. But you'd have these doors, and then you would enter in there, and there would be like bunks for maybe very tight space. So it's a super tight space. You're underground. Just think about that, in the cold, in all sorts of weather. And then we're talking about the Baltic. That's really north, so it's colder than now. So really far north. And you'd walk into it. It'd be dark, and there were sets of bunkers, maybe 2 or 3 sets right on top of each other on either side. And there might be like a little bit of something for a stove where they could kind of like cook some food or heat something up. And sometimes there would be a spout for that smoke of that stove to come out of the ground, so that, so the smoke wasn't in the bunker. But that's how they would live, and the individuals were there until, you know, they were discovered. Most of the bunkers, unfortunately, were bombed out by the Soviet Army. They just dropped a grenade and bombed the whole space. But the last individual, as far as I can remember in my research, that actually stayed hidden in a bunker, I believe was in Lithuania, and it was all the way until like 1961 or 65, so a very, very long time after the war. He